Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and welcome to another Liberate Raleigh video. The topic of this video will be a subcategory of what many people like to refer to as bottom unity, which is the union or cooperation of people who consider themselves libertarians but fall along the left-right liberal conservative, I guess, spectrum. So the topic that I'm going to cover today is what I consider a false conflict between capitalism and socialism. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people will take sides with respect to whether they support capitalism or socialism, and will generally completely reject the other side. However, I personally think that this conflict is unnecessary and pretty much pointless. So I do want to be clear that I'm referring to, in this instance, non-authoritarian socialists and capitalists. So you could think of that as voluntarists, socialists, anarcho-socialists, and not just socialists, any left-leaning sort of economic system like mutualism, communism, and the like. And then on the other side, anarcho-capitalism, voluntary capitalism, free market capitalism, all that sort of stuff. So again, the important thing to remember is that when you remove the authoritarianism, then the conflict between these two economic systems disappears. So I'm going to cover a number of reasons why this conflict is pointless and doesn't really make much sense. One of the first ones I'm going to talk about is that when you read the literature, the anarcho-capitalist and the anarcho-socialist style literature, what you'll find is that many institutions and solutions are championed and promoted by both of them. So let me give you some examples. Mutual aid societies, nonprofit organizations, fraternal societies. If you read left anarchism, obviously mutual aid societies, there was an entire book written by that title, by a person who's considered a left anarchist. Memory serves, that was Peter Kropotkin, book that I intend to read at some point, but he promoted mutual aid among human beings. But if you look at the anarcho-capitalist literature, when they talk about solutions to various public goods and services, a very common organization is a mutual aid society to handle things like welfare and other social assistance programs to help people get back on their feet. Obviously, there's also fraternal societies that, again, if you read the anarcho-capitalist and the left anarchist literature, these sorts of things are promoted. Left anarchists, I believe, will typically talk about worker fraternities and that sort of thing, and worker syndicates. Well, okay, syndicate may not necessarily fall under the social assistance category, but worker-based fraternal societies, as far as like the industry and career, is something that would appeal to the left. And of course, nonprofit organizations of all stripes for all reasons. Again, both widely accepted, obviously on the left side, but also the anarcho-capitalist side. There is no stipulation that under an anarcho-voluntary free market anarchist society or economic system that every firm is required to be profit-seeking. They can be non-profit seeking. And this is pointed out countless times. I've read that this is not a requirement. For example, I recently read and did some videos on the Voluntary City, the book The Voluntary City, and they point out that this sort of private provision for these sorts of public services, and sometimes in a non-profit manner, is considered a civil society. And this is all very well accepted within anarcho-capitalist and the left anarchist communities. So right off the bat, when we examine this supposed conflict between, left and right and capitalism and socialism, you run into the undeniable fact that they're talking about a lot of the same stuff and pointing to a lot of the same things as solutions to take over the things that the government and the state forces upon us. Even, for example, covenant communities, which is promoted mostly by Hoppian anarcho-capitalists, which is just a contractual agreement among people regarding their living space or their neighborhood. You might think that, and I have many criticisms of what Hoppe did with his treatment of covenant communities, but setting all that aside, the base theory behind it, the idea behind it, it's been around for probably for centuries, and it's also should appeal to the left, and in many cases does appeal, except they refer to them typically as intentional communities, which is effectively the same thing. It's a community of people that come together and live in a certain area for the purpose of implementing some goal of theirs. Usually for intentional communities, it has to do with environmentalism or green living or some sort of sustainability. But again, it's effectively the same thing. So again, what you're looking at when you think of this supposed conflict is you run into the fact that they're talking about the same thing, and in many instances referencing and promoting the same solutions to these problems. So right off the bat, that's one reason why this conflict should not be and is pretty much pointless in my opinion. Continuing on with this theme that the conflict between capitalism and socialism, and by extension you could think of the left and right anarchists and voluntarists, is a matter of simply different definitions for various terms. And to start with, I'm going to talk about how the left and anarcho-socialists view the term capitalism. Their definition is the older definition of the state in cooperation with the propertied capitalist class of people. So this is what they're talking about is where the government works with and is influenced by people who have money and wealth. And this is typically, this is the capitalist class of people, and they use it to implement various tyrannical things upon the population. This is what the left anarchists mean when they use the word capitalism. However, anarcho-capitalists mean something different when they use the term capitalism. They're using it to mean a private property, a proprietarian-based system of justice. However, the application of this for anarcho-capitalists is to implement a free market. So in a free market, people are free to choose whatever economic system they have. So it doesn't matter one way or the other whether they choose a socialist institution or any other type of capitalist institution. It comes down to this is the synonym for capitalism for the anarcho-capitalists is pretty much a free market. Now, going back to the left anarchists, what an anarcho-capitalist would refer to as capitalism is what an anarcho-socialist would refer to as simply the free market. This is pretty popular among the Center for a Stateless Society group. They like to talk about markets instead of capitalism, but again, they're using the term capitalism to mean state privilege as granted by the government to the class of capitalists, whereas the anarcho-capitalist is referring to what the left anarchists think of as simply the free market. So for anarcho-capitalists, this is simply a free market, and for the left anarchists, they also refer to it as a free market, but they are referring to their definition of what a free market is for all practical purposes the same thing that an anarcho-capitalist considers capitalism. So these different definitions for capitalism create a lot of confusion and a lot of conflict that can simply be cleared up by acknowledging the other's definitions and using that knowledge of each other's definitions to facilitate discussion and conversation and ultimately, bottom unity, cooperation. There is another term that is considered defined differently, whether somebody was, say, a pro-socialist anarchist or a pro-capitalist anarchist, and that is the definition of private property. Two very, very different things. For the left anarchist, when they use the term private property, what they mean is property as defended by the state that has been stolen from somebody and given to, through political influence, handed over to the capitalist class of people. So by this definition, private property is not a good thing. It's pretty much government theft at the behest of various politically connected wealthy individuals and this stolen loot. And this often takes the form of land. That's one thing that you'll see a lot of left anarchists talk about, and then essentially they're correct when they're talking about theft by the government of land, which is very often given to large corporations or wealthy individuals and adds to their fortunes. However, the anarcho-capitalist has a different definition of private property, and this again creates a lot of confusion and conflict between the two sides, which I do not think is necessary once the differences are acknowledged and accepted, and a dialogue can sprout up, which should lead to more cooperation between the two sides. So for an anarcho-capitalist or a right-leaning anarchist, private property simply refers to property that is not government property, which is referred to by anarcho-capitalists as public property. So private property is simply privately owned property. Like any private individual, anything that they have, that they own, they have ownership of, regardless of what it is, as long as it's not owned by the government and it's owned by private individuals, that is what the anarcho-capitalists consider private property. So it's a completely different thing than what left anarchists consider private property. So by definition, private property for the left anarchists is theft. However, anarcho-capitalists, it is not theft. It's simply privately owned goods and other things. And this is very important because it leads to the conclusion that because the definition of private property for anarcho-capitalists is simply non-government property or public property, it means that any property that is owned by leftist institutions like a mutualist society, a worker syndicate, a worker cooperative, anything along those lines is considered by the anarcho-capitalists as private property. And this is important because an anarcho-capitalist would subsequently consider that property legitimate and worthy of defense. So there is no conflict there. It's something that when you look at the definitions and you accept them, yes, an anarcho-capitalist, by their definition, would accept all of the property owned by any left-leaning institutional organization as valid private property. Similarly, the definition of private property by the leftists, which is effectively political tyranny and graft, and leeching and parasitic behavior, would be shunned and denigrated by anarcho-capitalists. For example, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, in The Anatomy of the State, Murray Rothbard said that and this quote may not be exact, but he said something along the lines of, the state forms a legal, orderly, systematic channel for the predation of private property. Private property, again, in the anarcho-capitalist sense, simply meaning non-government property, property owned by everybody. So the private property of the left anarchists would, in the Rothbardian sense, be considered theft and predation. So again, just looking at these definitions, we can see that when you understand both sides of the story here, when you understand how both sides look at these different words, there's no reason why there can't be a dialogue and cooperation, because again, a lot of what is being criticized and what is being promoted is mostly the same thing. So again, I think that these definitions and semantic arguments are pretty much not a reason to be avoiding talking to and cooperating with each other. Yet another point of contention that arises between capitalists and socialists is the idea of the Misesian calculation argument against socialism. So from an anarcho-capitalist point of view, it can be very easy to succumb to the idea that, well, it doesn't matter whether anybody agrees with anybody or anybody thinks that it's okay to that these socialist and left-leaning institutions are in fact created and promoted. It doesn't matter because the economic calculation argument debunks them all. Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that authoritarian socialism of the government variety, which is central planning, is definitively refuted by these things. However, we're not talking about that. We're talking about voluntary socialism, which is not the same thing. So you can construct these, have a free market which allows for these socialist institutions and still have prevailing markets, have prevailing prices, a prevailing price system, and a profit and loss system, all of which forms the economic framework within which calculation can occur. And even von Mises, in Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, mentioned worker syndicates and referred to them as worker capitalism. So he acknowledged the idea that these things could exist in a non-authoritarian, in a non-central planned framework. So there's no reason why these things can't occur, and in this sense, the calculation argument doesn't definitively refute them because they can exist just fine within a capitalist framework, as with respect to within a free market framework wherein market prices and profits and losses can still occur. One final point regarding the economic calculation argument against socialism. It's very important also to understand that it's not necessarily an argument against socialism per se. It's an argument against the eradication of market prices
and therefore the profit and loss signals. And this is apparent this was brought up and shown to be true by Murray Rothbard in his classic economic treatise, Man, Economy, and State. So the point here is that the economic calculation argument does not simply apply to all these left-leaning socialist institutions. It applies equally to capitalist, profit-seeking institutions, as Rothbard pointed out. It is possible for that sort of company or firm to grow so large or so vertically integrated or integrated in other manners such that they eliminate various markets which would be necessary for that firm to have access to in order to have the pricing information necessary to engage in economic calculation and be able to make economic decisions. And what Rothbard concluded was that this creates a limiting factor upon the size of firms and companies that may exist on the free market. So this economic calculation argument is broadly applicable and not necessarily confined to simply the analysis of socialist or socialist institutions or worker syndicates and the like. As per Rothbard, it also applies to capitalist institutions. It's a general rule that applies to everything, and it can be a problem or for any of these institutions regardless. So again, the argument economic calculation in and of itself is not a reason to simply reject all these left-leaning institutions. It applies equally to capitalist institutions, and as long as, again, once you remove the authoritarian central planning, and allow these sorts of these institutions to arise naturally, then it's okay. These market prices, because people are allowed to freely exchange on the market, barter, buy and sell using money, whatever, market prices can prevail, and all of these institutions will be able to engage in economic calculation. So again, there's really no reason for this conflict between capitalism and socialism once the authoritarianism is the critical problem. Once you remove the state, and again, an anarcho-capitalist and an anarcho-socialist would both want that to occur, and on both sides, there are people on both sides that will accept the existence of the other and allow it to occur. There are leftist anarchists that would be fine with allowing capitalist companies and firms to exist, and conversely, capitalist anarcho-capitalists that have no issue with socialist or other left-leaning institutions or firms from arising on the free market. So again, the problem is government, central planning, and authoritarianism. That is the enemy, not the left and the right, even with respect to the economic calculation argument. Another reason why I don't think that there should be any this sort of conflict between capitalists and socialists and their institutions which they promote is I don't see any reason why, and I would expect to occur, both to exist within the same geographic region. I would assume, in fact, I would be astonished if an actual free market was allowed to exist, that there wouldn't be both, say for example, worker-owned companies, worker cooperatives, or syndicates, and the like. Mutual aid societies would almost certainly, I would be doubly floored, considering they were so prominent in the 19th century in the United States. I would be astonished if
all of those things did not exist, while at the same time, say, profit-seeking capitalist firms and companies existed side by side and working in cooperation. And the critical thing to remember is that once the oppression and the interference and authoritarianism of the government and of the state is removed from the situation, you're going to get only those institutions that tend to meet the that satisfy the preferences and wants and needs of the people. You're not going to have capitalist firms that can simply go to the government, donate $1 million to a bunch of politicians to get political influence to erect regulations and other laws which serve to protect them from competition. It's simply not going to happen. And then conversely, you're not going to get government-run like welfare or social services that would be handled, that could very possibly be handled through these left-leaning institutions, mutual aid societies, and so on and so forth. They would be handled privately under that system, and so they would be far better than anything that the government would come up with. So in this sense, you're going to have a potpourri of different institutions and solutions that would handle all of the needs and producing all of the goods and services that people want. So this would, again, I would be shocked if this didn't happen over the same geographic area. There would probably be cooperation among people. And the other thing is, so, I mean, there might be some people that are strict down the line. I'm just only going to associate with capitalist institutions, or I'm only going to associate with socialist institutions. But when you're talking about populations of many millions of people, hopefully everybody in the world someday this will apply to, so billions of people, people tend to be a lot more complex. Maybe they'll favor a socialist institution for one aspect of their life and a capitalist institution in other aspects of their lives. There's no reason why people can't pick and choose. That's pretty much the beauty of the free market, is that we have all of these things in front of us and we can choose what we want, and it's like a buffet line. Maybe we want to have, I want to be part of this mutual aid society to handle maybe my insurance, or I want to be a part of this mutual aid society to because I'm going to contribute resources to it in case I lose my job and I need some financial support to get me through that tough time until I can find a new job. Maybe I might want to work for, at the same time, I'm a member of this mutual aid society. I'm a wage earner at a profit-seeking capitalist company, because maybe they have a particular environment or lifestyle there that appeals to me. So there's no reason why we can't pick and choose. So one example that I came up with that I thought might be relevant, and I could see occurring, is and it would foster cooperation among the institutions themselves, is, let's say, for example, there's an organization, it's a mutual aid society, and they handle, there's tons of people that are members of it, and everybody contributes resources to its running. And what it does is it takes the place of like what the government does with welfare. They help people when they come upon tough times. They might give them financial support. They might have services that help them find new employment somewhere, or maybe give them skills training that makes them more marketable in the labor market. But pretty much it's an association that helps people get back on their feet. And let's say, for example, part of that is that maybe some people lose their jobs and they can't pay their rent,
or they can't pay their mortgage, or they're unable to contribute resources to some other institution, like a mutual institution wherein they're living in some communal area. Anything can happen that can cause them to not be able to have a place to live. And so this mutual aid society requires a certain number of units that they need to have access to, so that some of their members who are currently without a place to live, without shelter, can live until they find employment, get back on their feet, and can get their own place. So let's say they need like 100 units. It would be perfectly reasonable and plausible for that mutual aid society to turn to, say, a profit-seeking property management company that, say, runs apartment complexes, and this mutual aid society decides, well, we'd like to have a standing rental lease for 100 apartment units, and we want to be able to put people in there as we need and see fit. So the property management company gets, well, they get a large customer that's, you know, renting out 100 units every month, and the mutual aid society is able to not worry about the management of the properties themselves or the units themselves. They can concentrate on, say, skills training, managing, providing resources to people. They can focus on that aspect of what they're doing without having to worry about, okay, on top of it, we have to manage property. We have to manage the apartment units or whatever, or the housing units. That can be taken off and put on the property management company so that they can specialize in doing those things, whereas the mutual aid society can specialize in helping people get back on their feet. So what this results in is a better division of labor, more specialization, and ultimately it works out better for everybody involved, and most importantly for the people at large, who now have, you know, they have both of these options to choose from. And the mutual aid society it benefits, and the property management company benefits. So I don't see any reason why it's implausible for the institutions to work together cooperatively, for people to work cooperatively. They might, again, people are very complex. They, they may favor socialist institutions in some manner, in some ways, and then capitalist institutions in other ways. There's no way to know for sure ahead of time, because I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did, but I don't. So ultimately, what it comes down to is there's no reason for all this conflict. Once you get rid of the authoritarianism and the government tyranny and the violence behind it all of the areas of conflict between supposed areas of conflict between capitalism and socialism, and socialist institutions and capitalist institutions, once you remove the state and you're living in what is actually a free market, there's no reason for this conflict. In fact, I would be very surprised if implementing a free market didn't lead to tons of cooperation between all kinds of organizations, institutions of all different stripes, whether they be capitalist, Georgist, mutualist, socialist, whatever. I think that's what would happen. I don't see any reason for anarchists on both sides to be arguing over this and fighting with each other. I think the reasons why we're fighting don't make much sense when you really think about it, when you look at things. We should be cooperating and working together to get rid of the government and get rid of the state and its authoritarianism. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say in this video. I hope that this was interesting to everybody watching it, and I hope maybe it gets you to think a little bit more about the quote-unquote bottom unity between the left and the right, libertarian and anarchist movements. So again, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in the next video.